So, Dr. Leon, should I call you Dr. Leon?
Michael will be fine.
Michael is okay. It's very good to meet you. I was pretty excited when I saw the research that you published on olfactory enrichment, at night. And the reason I was excited was because I'd already been trying to find out what happens if you inhale essential oils while you're asleep. And there was, as I'm sure you know, some research on this already. Um, but this, your paper really took it to another level, I guess you could say. Um, so to kick off, what inspired you to study neuroscience and in particular olfaction?
Well, I was going to college. I went to Brooklyn College in New York, which is a wonderful, at that time, free college, which no longer is free, but was free when I went there. And I decided to take a summer course, and that didn't take up all of my time. So I looked for a job, and I found a job in one of the laboratories, and they were doing endocrinology research. And gradually I became interested in that and started doing research with them. And at one point, I had for a photograph I was taking, I separated mothers and their young. These are rat mothers, and it turns out that the rats made a beeline for the mother when they were returned, and their eyes were closed, and the mother wasn't making any sound. So it looked like it was an odor she was putting out that was attractive. And so we spent a fair bit of time looking at that problem, both from the perspective of how the mothers produce odors, and that's a whole interesting story. And then we looked at the neurobiology of this interesting form of natural early learning. And that's what really got me into neuroscience and studying olfaction. It turns out that this kind of early learning changes the brain so that it thereafter gives a very special signal to this learned odor. And we then went on to show that the same kind of learning happens to humans on the first day of life. They learn to become attracted to the odor of their mother or any other odor that you pair with her contact. And again, we were pursuing that for quite a while. We then decided that we really didn't know enough about odor coding, that is, how different chemicals produce different perceptions. So we spent another decade looking at that. That project involved more than 15 million unique pieces of data. So it was a massive study. And we, at one point, realized that we could predict the chemical based on the perception, the chemical based on the neural response, and the perception based on the neural response. And so that gave us some good feedback to tell us that we were on the right track. We then started to look at this idea of olfactory stimulation, stimulating the brain early in life. As I said, it forms this particular kind of learning. But what we were particularly interested in is the ability of odors to take the place of what's called environmental enrichment. Environmental enrichment involves giving individuals a lot more stimulation, motor stimulation, visual, auditory, olfactory.
Any kind of stimulation.
Any kind of stimulation. And what this does is that it changes the brain dramatically. If you look at the brains of rats and mice who are in a standard laboratory cage, there's not much for them to do there. They're pretty isolated and deprived. And if you take them and put them into so-called enriched environment, which is a much bigger cage with some friends and many things to do, their brains become much more complex and much more capable. And even more interesting is when you engineer various human neurological disorders to occur in these rats and mice. They have the symptoms just like humans have. They look very much like the human condition. That's why they're good animal models of these disorders. When you put them in a standard box cage, they show most of the human symptoms, the human-like symptoms. However, when you take these animals who have these disorders, and they're all engineered into their brains, and you put them in an enriched environment, the symptoms either decrease markedly or completely gone after a while. And so this is a very powerful kind of manipulation. And there have been 24 neurological disorders that have been treated in rats and mice in this way successfully, but no one had used it for humans, which is quite remarkable. I think everybody thought that humans got quite enough stimulation as it was, maybe too much as it was. And so we thought, well, maybe they didn't.
Michael, so far I've asked you one question.
Sure.
And you've answered a couple of others that I haven't answered.
Okay.
You've answered them anyway. What have you been up to?
So that's what we've been up to.
I have one question about what you said earlier. I'm curious to know, do we know with mother-infant bonding, where does the odor come from? Is it breath? Is it skin? Is it somewhere else? Do we know?
Right. So in humans, it comes from the breast milk, and it changes depending on what the mother has eaten, for example. And in rats and mice and rabbits, they have a specialized structure in their gut. The food goes into it. It's really like a functional appendix, and it's actually the largest organ in a rat or mouse or rabbit.
So and it's part of the digestive system?
It's in the digestive system, and it's called the cecum. And this is where they produce the vitamins that they don't get in their daily meal. And they re-ingest the substance as it comes out the back end. So some of it is nutritional, and so that's where the odors are. And the different diets select for different populations of microbes, bacteria, that put out different odors. And so that's why different individuals have different odors when you test them. And that's why the young have to learn the odor. They can't be born being attracted to a single odor. Each individual has a different one.
I was interested to see, looking at some research, that breast milk is quite odorous. It contains many compounds that we're familiar with, limonene, pinene, other terpenes. And obviously, depending on diet and other factors, it's fairly different from one individual to another.
Yeah. And so the infants have to learn the odor of their mother when they come out.
Okay. I'm going to look at my sheet of questions.
Okay, be my guest.
Okay, so how much do we know about how olfaction works? How far have we come since Buck and Axel in 1991? And for anyone who doesn't know, this was the discovery of genes and olfactory receptors.
Right. So this was a brilliant piece of scientific exploration. Nobody knew how odors were being processed, how it turns from a chemical into a perception. And they found out that there's this wonderfully complex system. In mice, there's about over 1,000 of these genes that code for receptors. In humans, it's many fewer. But what it is that it's not just one or two or three receptors, as there is, for example, for the visual system. but there are thousands. There is over 1,000 of them in mice. And what we and others have found is that it's a combination of factors that allow you to determine which odor is there. And what we found is that each chemical has different characteristics, a number of different characteristics, and each receptor codes for part of that perception. And so it binds to different parts of the chemical, and together they form a perception of a particular odor.
Yeah. So is there anything left for us to find out, or do we know everything now about how olfaction works?
We need to know more about how olfaction works past the first neuronal connection. So we know a lot about what happens at the first receptor and the first neuron. We know about when it interacts with the second neuron. That's the first connection. After that, it goes to
being in the olfactory bulb.
Yes, it's in the olfactory bulb. After it comes out of the olfactory bulb, it gets even more complex. It's not a simple characteristic organization. And people are still looking at that. And it's been a rough ride to find out more about what's going on in the so-called back of the brain.
But it's interesting that many of the olfactory bodies in the brain also function in memory. So we have this, anatomical coincidence almost.
Yeah. So all the senses can impact the memory centers of the brain, but all the other senses have to go through the part of the brain called the thalamus. We regard it as the side streets of the brain because it doesn't have a direct connection. The olfactory system is the only one that has a direct connection into the memory centers and into the emotional center of the brain. And so consequently, we thought it would benefit the brain to have more of this kind of stimulation.
Okay. What do we have? So in your research that was published just, 3 or 4 months ago?
Yeah.
I was very excited to see this, and I think many others were as well. Tell me, what kind of response have you had from academia, from the press, from other quarters?
We've obviously touched a nerve. So the last time I looked, there were about 280,000 people who had read the paper. And that's about 1,000 times more than most papers like that. Yeah. So people are very interested. There have been almost 200 news stories around the world in many languages and many kinds of publications, a number of podcasts, TV show. It's really caught people's imagination. And it maybe has to do with the idea that people like pleasant odors. And if you can improve your brain with pleasant odors, that may be something that's attractive to them. And so people have gone out and bought diffusers and bought all this stuff, and they are doing it themselves at home. It's one nice thing is that it's harmless at worst, and it looks like it can be beneficial at best.
In the aromatherapy world, one curiosity is that it's always been 98% female, 2% male, people in the field. Mm-hmm. Have you noticed anything like that with this, with olfactory enrichment? Is there anything you've noticed about, discrimination?
Yeah, so we haven't looked at that carefully. Certainly, when we were recruiting people for the study, most of them were women. So there's a different kind of interest in it. However, both men and women lose their memory as they get older. And we found that both men and women are very concerned about losing their memory, and they are fascinated by the prospect of doing something for their memory without having to do anything. So that turns out to be a critical aspect of this as well.
Turn on the diffuser and that's it. So
yeah. So if you ask people who had a heart attack and they're being asked to take a low dose aspirin, half of them don't do it. And so it's not the cost. It's the bother and just having to do something, and people tend not to do it.
Are lazy people.
Yes.
The 7 essential oils that you used in the study, I'm just going to list them briefly: rose, orange, eucalyptus, lemon, peppermint, rosemary, lavender. So the first 4 are used in smell training. Peppermint and rosemary are known for improving cognitive function, and lavender aids sleep as well as cognitive function in some studies. Am I right in thinking that this was your rationale for picking those?
Well, there's a researcher named Thomas Hummel from Germany, and he has done some wonderful research. And one of the things he showed is, he calls this olfactory training, that you can restore the olfactory system with different odors. And so the first 4 odors we took were the 4 odors that he used initially. And we thought, why not? It looked like other people were including his lab, were finding nice effects from exposure to those 4 odorants. And the others we added because they were pleasant. People liked them, and they didn't seem to have any negative aspects to them. And they were affordable. And so we used those, and they're readily available, as you know, and so it was easy to obtain all the stuff that we needed.
Okay, so, but you, okay, so let me be more specific then. Did you pick rosemary because of its reputation for improving cognitive function?
So no, we just picked them because they were pleasant and easily obtained and all that. So we don't come from the aromatherapy world, and so we're not really aware of these kinds of findings. And
well, that's why we're having this discussion, because we come from 2 different worlds that actually coincide in many areas. Okay, so long question coming up. In your paper, you say limitations of the study include its small sample size and the single odorant that could be diffused each night due to the design of the diffusion device. A Korean study used 40 odorants. The Korean study used 40 odorants. Do you have plans to find out what the optimum number of odorants would be? Perhaps 5, 10, 20 would work as well as 40. I mean, do we know what the optimum number is?
So different researchers have used different numbers of odorants. They've used different concentrations. They've used different times of day. They've used different odorants. And so there's a lot of information out there. No one has any conclusive idea of what is the best. The most impressive finding comes from the Korean study, where they used 40 odorants. And it is, in fact, they use them on demented people, so people with Alzheimer's disease typically. And they found remarkably strong improvements on a variety of memory tests. And no one has ever found anything like that with any drug. And so olfactory enrichment at this point is actually the most effective treatment for memory loss in dementia. So, I mean, there have been billions of dollars spent looking at different drugs, hundreds of clinical trials. None of them have come close to the efficacy of olfactory enrichment for it. So we wanted to use that same approach. And so we designed a device that will require even less effort. It's called memory air. If people are interested in it, they can go to memoryair.com and we'll let you know when it's available. But what it does is it sits on your nightstand. At the start of the month, you put in a belt that has 40 odors in it, press a button, close the door, and then every night from that night on, it will come on an hour after you go to sleep, present 40 odors twice a night as you're sleeping, and that we think will automate this procedure so that you don't have to do anything. So for the next month, you literally don't have to do anything other than going to sleep to get the kind of stimulation that we think your brain needs. And the idea is that this number is the strongest outcome that anyone's found, and that's why we decided to automate that number. But it may be that 37 is the optimal, and with the 16 odors that we're not using. So eventually we'll figure all that out. But at this point, we're going to go with the strongest outcome and see if we can make that automatic.
Right. I mean, it's incredible that your study went on for 6 months. The Korean study was 15 days.
Yeah.
And yet the results were almost comparable, you could say.
Yeah, and so we're giving a very minimal form of olfactory enrichment, 1 odor a night, and they're giving 40 odors twice a day. So that's an enormous change and improvement. The Hummel lab has actually given 72 odors in a theater. They've had a group of people sitting with odors coming at them in a big theater. And I think they got their improvements in olfaction even more rapidly than the Korean study. So it looks like the number of odors is consequential. And if it can do it that rapidly, it looks like it's tapping into something really fundamental.
Okay. So in your study, you had people diffusing for the first 2 hours of night, which I think was related to this is when slow wave sleep happens, more or less. And slow wave sleep helps consolidation of memories. Am I right?
Yeah, early in the night, you're getting mostly slow wave sleep. The cycles that occur in sleep, where they go through the different parts of the sleep cycle, take about 90 minutes. So we thought it was important to get at least one sleep cycle in to this because the improvements may be in slow wave sleep, but they also could be in rapid eye movement sleep, so-called REM sleep. And we wanted to be able to get both of those things in there.
Right. So all-night diffusion isn't a problem anyway.
It doesn't seem so. It would be a problem if it interfered with sleep. But if anything, it looks like it improves sleep.
So your main takeaway from your study was the 226% improvement from the 5th Ravel test. So the Ravel test is a memory test of word recall. I'm just going to say that for now. However, you just quoted the 5th test results. And in this test, the test is run 5 times. And you just took the results from the 5th test, which seems to be uncommon. So I'm going to quote from the National Institute of Neurological Disorders and Stroke. Different summary scores are derived from raw Ravel scores. These include Ravel Immediate, the sum of scores from the first 5 trials, Learning, the score of trial 5 minus the score of trial 1, and Forgetting, the score of trial 5 minus the score of delayed recall. And you didn't do any of those things.
Right.
So you went rogue, Michael.
Yes. So we had done a pilot study before we ran this study. We ran it during the day. We had people sit for a while and just smell the odors while they were watching television or reading at night. And we did it for 6 months. And after that time, we looked at the data. So when you're doing something for the first time, when you're running a clinical trial, for example, for the first time, you want to look at the data and see if there's anything unusual or interesting going on. And we found that in this particular part of the Rayvold test, there was a dramatic improvement just in the individuals who had received olfactory enrichment. And it was comparable to what we subsequently found with giving it at night. And so that allowed.
But it seems like you're cherry picking the data in a way that, people don't normally do.
Yeah. So my feeling is that you really do have to look at the data rather than blindly following somebody else's way of analyzing it. There's nothing magical about taking one thing and subtracting it from another. What you want to do is to see whether there are dramatic differences. And that's what we found. And then for this study, we were able to say, we will be looking at this particular statistical comparison. That is, so we didn't go cherry picking after the fact. It's important to make your statistical comparisons upfront so that you can't be fooling around with the data after it comes out. So the first thing that you do is you look at the data, see anything that is unusual or striking, and then you can predict with your second experiment in a predictive way what things you're going to be analyzing. So that's what we did, and that's why we found it. And it also turned out to be a striking effect, even when it was given at night.
Okay. I know that I'm not the only person who's brought up this point with you. Perhaps in future you can do a study that wouldn't be criticized in that way.
Absolutely. So we are planning a study that will involve hundreds of individuals and using our device with 40 odors twice a night and with pre-planned statistical analyses, and that will take care of those things. And this is really a proof of concept publication. It's not the final word. We will need a large study with brain imaging and many people, hundreds of people exposed to this, and then we will feel more comfortable. At the same time, I should point
with the small numbers you had, it really was a pilot study, wasn't it?
Yeah, I mean it's early days. The encouraging thing is that it's consistent with what's developing into a fairly significant literature. So there are maybe 24 publications by now showing similar things. So if you give olfactory enrichment, olfactory training to people, their cognition improves in a number of ways. Their brain areas improve in a number of ways. And this is just consistent with all of those findings. So that adds to our confidence.
The idea that this works. I do believe it works. In your study and in the Korean study, only essential oils were used. So I wanted to ask you about memory air. Does it use essential oils or not?
So we're using all natural oils, and we do that because people like the idea of having natural odors rather than chemicals, although, of course, the natural odors are chemicals. But it just is, we want people to have a pleasant experience, both in terms of when they smell it and in terms of just being comfortable with having odors in their bedroom. It looks, on the other hand, other people, again, in this growing literature, other people have used odors that are not essential oils and found essentially the same kinds of things. So, for example, sommeliers, wine tasters in training, the way that they train them to recognize odors in fine wines is that they sniff dozens of odors every day for months and months. And their memory centers of the brain expand significantly. Master perfumers in training have the same phenomenon. and they're just smelling different kinds of odors. So it's less about the particular odors that are given and more about multiple odor experiences that seem to be important for cognition.
Good. Well, I'm glad to hear that your product is using only natural oils. That's good to know. Are you using the same ones that were used in the Korean study, or you picture?
Yeah, many of them are similar, which is what you'd expect when you have so many oils and so many possibilities.
Right, that's true. So if you're diffusing essential oils to in any way improve health, this is pretty much the definition of aromatherapy, and yet you're saying this isn't aromatherapy. Can you talk about it?
Yeah. So, maybe you'd be more comfortable if we said it was a special form of aromatherapy. And the idea is that, to my knowledge, aromatherapy really is selecting a particular odor and looking for the effects on the human body for a single odor. What this does is that it puts together many single odors, right, in an organized way, so that the phenomenon is less about which odor, but how many odors, and that. So you can call it aromatherapy. I'm fine with that. If you don't call it aromatherapy, I'm fine with that too. The idea is that it's different from what most people regard as aromatherapy.
Okay. I'm going to respectfully suggest that I would be a better person to define what aromatherapy is than you, having been in the field for more than 50 years. But your point is taken. Perhaps we agree to disagree on one tiny point.
Okay. So do you want to make that clear what the point is?
Well, you're saying that aromatherapy is a particular oil to do a particular thing, and yes, that is aromatherapy. But aromatherapy is also smelling essential oils just to feel good.
Okay, but there isn't, to my knowledge, an aspect of aromatherapy that says you must have a dozen odors today.
Well, there is now.
Okay.
You have entered our field, Michael.
Fair enough.
Yeah, well, whether we call this aromatherapy or not really doesn't matter, of course. Let's move on. So this is a comment. So I've got one more critique on your paper.
Right.
This is a comment from a cognitive function researcher, and his name is Mark Moss. He's from the UK. The brain imaging was done over a range of 6 to 17 months. So some participants had scans as long as 11 months after the study effectively ended. This data cannot be considered as reliable. I very much think this study needs to be replicated and expanded to employ a wider range of sensitive tests to be convincing.
I agree. We ran into a buzzsaw that was called the pandemic. And I think we had recruited 173 people for the studies. So it was going to be a much larger study. We had planned on having 200 before the pandemic hit. And that put a kink in our plans for sure. And what happened is that we just were able to analyze the data we had. And even though you'd expect a great deal of variability that would wash out any kind of statistical significance, we actually found that there remain statistical differences in the brain. But he's right, we need to replicate it with many more people, and we have that in the works. And so, yeah, I mean, this is the first shot. This is a proof of concept. It's not the final word, and we don't intend it to be the final word. And so we're going to continue to look at this. And again, other people have found changes in the brain with olfactory exposure. And, we think our data are consistent with pretty much everything else that's been published in the field.
Right. Well, you have a unique talent. You managed to answer questions just before I asked them.
Great minds work in similar ways.
So, yeah, I mean, my last question is, how do you plan to take your research to the next stage? And you've already told us that.
Well, so the first thing that we have on our planning board is we're going to look at normal older adults who have a normal level of memory loss. We're going to look at hundreds of those, and we're going to see whether we can replicate and extend our findings. The second thing we're going to do is to look at people who have Alzheimer's disease. And we want to see whether we can improve their lot with our memory air device. And that approach, I think, will be really important, because right now it's one thing to say, you can treat dementia with giving 40 odors twice a day, but nobody's going to do that. It's just an enormous amount of work.
During the
And
day.
so, it's one thing to say, if you do this, your memory will get better, but then nobody does it. And so you're not going to have any kind of phenomenon. So what we'd like to do is to use our automated system and see whether we can get similar kinds of things. And we want to do it for a longer period of time, look at the changes that occur in the brain.
You mean longer than 6 months?
Longer than 15 days.
Oh, right.
So, we want to see whether the longer you do it, the more that they improve, or maybe they've hit a ceiling after a few days.
Have you been in touch with the researchers in Korea?
Yeah, they haven't responded, but that happens.
It does.
Yeah, I mean, they really don't have. Maybe they're doing the same kinds of things as we speak. So we're going to be doing that, and then we also have some preliminary data showing that it looks like we can improve the executive function in school children, and we're going to be looking at that. And it turns out that pretty much all neurological disorders and many somatic disorders, heart disease, cancer, so forth, schizophrenia, stroke, depression, on and on, all of them are associated with olfactory loss. And it may be the case that it's the olfactory loss that precedes the other symptoms. And it's the olfactory loss that puts you at risk for developing these symptoms of these various disorders. So, for example, the first symptom of Alzheimer's disease or Parkinson's disease is olfactory loss. And it could be that we may be able to reverse, excuse me, we may be able to reverse the ability of these diseases to have all of these symptoms. So it may be possible, and this is a complicated notion, to have a disease but not the symptoms. And you can see this with Alzheimer's disease, for example. There are people who have all the neuropathology, all the neural damage that you see in Alzheimer's disease, but they don't have memory loss. They don't have the symptoms. And the reason seems to be that these individuals had a great deal of environmental enrichment in their lives. They've had high level of education, a complex, cognitively challenging career, and complex social interactions.
But now you're speculating.
Oh, well, no. So people have found all of this. I mean, so we know that this phenomenon exists. It's called cognitive reserve.
No, we know the phenomenon exists, but we don't know why for sure, do we?
We don't know why, but it looks like so it's correlated with the fact that they've had cognitive stimulation over the course of their lives. And on the other extreme, the people who are most likely to develop dementia are the illiterate, who have had very little cognitive stimulation. And so it may be possible for the olfactory stimulation as adults can take the place of years of education and all that, because it goes directly into the memory areas. And so it may be possible for us to prevent the expression of many of these neurological symptoms with olfactory exposure.
So I know some years ago there was research showing a correlation between dementia and olfactory loss. But now we know that this is true for dozens and dozens of neurological diseases that olfactory loss is involved. So in a way, has it lost its diagnostic relevance? If it can be, indicative of so many different conditions, then it doesn't really tell you what the problem is.
Yeah, so the problem is never going to be the loss of olfaction. It's always going to be the loss of memory, the loss of heart
but it's
function.
not specifically diagnostic.
Yeah. So yeah, you're right. It's not going to be diagnostic, but it could be therapeutic, which means we could be using olfactory enrichment to prevent all sorts of human neurological and somatic disorders.
Yeah, it's
So yes, that's
really, aren't they?
right. So that is speculative, but it's an interesting speculation.
In the world of academia and research, we can talk about treating Alzheimer's disease. But if you're promoting a product out there in the marketplace, then the FDA might come down on you quite heavily if you start talking about dementia and Alzheimer's.
Yeah, so we have had extensive conversations with the FDA, and they are fine if we talk about promoting mental wellness or mental acuity or memory, and that's fine. So we don't have to say that we can treat Alzheimer's effectively, because that's a disease, and you have to be approved by the FDA to treat diseases. But they happen to have a symptom that's called memory loss, and if we can improve memory, doesn't matter if it's through Alzheimer's disease or Parkinson's disease or schizophrenia or AIDS or any of the ways that you can get dementia. We're just treating and improving your memory. So they're fine with that.
So last question, I think.
Okay.
Are you turning into an entrepreneur now?
No, I'm business challenged. But I do have some friends who are brilliant business people, and they are taking with this and running with it, and they are having a great deal of fun doing this because it looks like there is enormous interest in this. We've raised quite a bit of money for people who agree with us. And it should be coming out onto the market the end of January, early February. And our test marketing has shown that, again, there's enormous interest in this sort of thing.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Michael, for answering all of my questions.
You're welcome. Thank you for inviting me.